Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am really glad to be back with all of you tonight for the third session of this book talk series. I'm actually on the West Coast this time. I don't have my usual setup here, but I'm really happy to be coming to you from a different part of the world. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. Make sure to chat to everyone so that we can see who's here with us in the room. Also, that's where you can add your questions throughout our conversation tonight. We are so glad to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world. And thanks to Jewish Live for helping us with streaming. A few words about JWA, as always, for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive. We work to expand and transform the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe very vociferously that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for participating in that with us. The book talks are just one piece of our work, and I hope that you will check out jwa.org to explore all the other things that we offer. I am so excited tonight to welcome an old friend of both mine and JWA's. Alicia Jo Rabins is a writer, musician, composer, performer, teacher of Torah. Her works explore the intersection of ancient wisdom texts and everyday life, as you'll see in our conversation tonight. In addition to the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, Even God Had Bad Parenting Days. I love the cover. She is the author of Fruit Geode, a National Jewish Book Award finalist for poetry, and we've actually had her on the book talks to discuss that before. She's also the creator and performer of A Kaddish for Bernie Madoff, which you can rent on any streaming platform, any of the main streaming platforms. It's an award-winning independent feature film. And she's also a creator and performer of Girls in Trouble, a song cycle and curriculum about the complicated lives of biblical women. And you can find some pieces of that on our site and the full set on her own site. She comes to us from Portland, Oregon. So we're on the same coast tonight. Welcome, Alicia. So great to be with you again.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Judith, and welcome to my adopted coast.
So it's really fun to get to talk to you about another project, and I'm always just amazed at the way that you bring together so many different creative forms and with Torah and lots of insight. And so tell us a little bit about how you came to this project.
Well, the big picture is that I have worked for a long time as a writer and a musician, which isn't really related to this project, but and a Jewish educator, so sort of scholar and teacher of Jewish texts, working a lot with B'nai Mitzvah students and also with teens and adults and sometimes kids. So everything that I do is kind of this swirling mix of art, storytelling, Jewish texts, feminism, and really, like you said in my bio, kind of searching for the place where these ancient texts really intersect with contemporary life, especially from a feminist point of view. And so I have my background as a writer is actually as a poet, and this is my very first book of prose. So it's a big new kind of fun challenge. It's been a fun challenge and a learning experience for me. And I probably would not have had the chutzpah to decide to write a whole book of prose, since I am coming out of poetry, except that they began as short essays for the website Kveller, which I'm sure that some people on this chat might know about. It's a great Jewish parenting website. And when I became a mother, which happened 10 and a half years ago now, I realized almost immediately after having my daughter that I was going to be seeing the world in a new way, essentially. And I got very curious about how this would affect different parts of my life. And as a student and teacher of Torah, I instantly became curious about how this would affect my reading of Torah and the Torah portion in particular. And so I basically pitched Kveller and said, can I write like a short essay each week that is reading the Torah portion, the weekly Torah portion, through the eyes of a new mom, and seeing what themes come out, how I relate differently to it when I'm reading it through this very intense perspective of being with an infant and having just made this transition. And so I did that for a year with occasionally a friend would contribute an essay because it was a little much to do it every single week. And then at the end, I had this
That does seem pretty ambitious for a new mom.
yeah, yes. And I should say I'm like a new mom who also found there's so many ways of making that transition. And I found that continuing to do my work was what the greatest hope for my own mental health. I know some people really actually need to step away and take a break. And for me, that was just not going to work. So I was not having to push myself to do it. I was actually really grateful to do it. And one of the things that happened because of that was that actually a close friend of mine, Vanessa Hua, who's a novelist in San Francisco, was really encouraging. And, you know, she's this prose writer friend of mine. I'm this poet kind of writing in prose for the first time, publishing prose for the first time. And she's also a mom of twins who are a couple years older, 1 year older than mine. And she kept saying, I think you should collect these. I think it's a book. And I at first was like, what are you talking about? And it kind of got in the back of my mind. And it was really moving to me that she wasn't Jewish, actually, and that she found these essays about Jewish text and motherhood meaningful as a mom. And that really meant a lot to me. And so a few years later, when the Jewish publisher, Behrman House, came to me and had kind of seen my work out and about and said, do you have any prose projects that you're thinking about? I said, well, actually, there's this thing that's been in the back of my mind for a while. And so the last step of this story is that I collected all the essays. We looked at them together, and I realized I didn't want to keep it as a Torah commentary because that felt so kind of limited in what I could talk about. And I realized if I was putting something out for the wider world, I wanted to be able to bring in some of my most influential and the most meaningful to me Jewish concepts that may not be linked to a portion, whether they're mystical concepts or ethical concepts or rabbinic ideas. And so I ended up really rewriting all the essays that I decided to keep in, kind of leaving out maybe half of them and creating half again as many new ones that were addressing themes that I was like, if I really had one chance to talk about early parenthood and Jewish texts and Jewish tradition and spirituality, what would I want to say? So I made this big spreadsheet, and the result is this book, which is made up of these short essays. So if you haven't seen it, it's like these 2 or 3 page personal essays, very bite-sized. And part of the idea of that is that any new parent could sort of grab one, read it, and put it down and not have to make this big commitment and not have to have like continuity from page to page to page.
Yeah, it is delicious bites. And I want to also say, and you write so beautifully in the preface about language, that though the book is speaking about mothers and parents, that you're really being much more inclusive about, you know, people who do any loving and caring. And obviously in our community, we're not all parents, but I think I want to really, I really want to emphasize that this book is larger than that specific set of relationships. And I love that your friend who's not Jewish could find meaning in these essays around parenthood. And I think there are a lot of people who are not parents who would find meaning in these pieces around just other life lessons.
That was very much my hope. And I very much wrote it in mind with like parents of all genders, people in all kinds of family configurations, step parents, people who are thinking about becoming parents, people who are not parents, but might be close to a child or interested in children or be an auntie or, you know, and so that was something that I really tried to hold in my mind as I wrote and edited, because I think the essential experience of being an adult interacting with responsibility and intimacy towards a child, whether that's for 1 minute in passing or whether that's, you know, every single second of every single day, that is a basic human experience. It does not require like parenthood to have.
Yeah. And we, you know, at JWA, we think a lot about multi-generational relationships and learning and the many directions that goes in. And so I felt so many of those lessons were really applicable and important, emanating from this book. So read us a little piece so that everyone can have a taste of what you're doing here.
Okay, I'd love to. So I'll just show you. It looks like this. And I'm going to read the first essay, which is called The Pain of Mini Essay. Essay sounds a little intimidating. First little bite, first cookie, which is called The Pain of Raising Children, which sounds like a downer, but it's not, I hope. Over baked pasta casserole last night, I told my kids I was writing a book about being a mom. Any stories you want me to include, I asked them, as my husband Aaron doled out baby carrots. Elijah, age 3, just wanted to make sure he was in the book. Sylvia, big sister that she is, yelled out exactly what to include. The time I threw up in Dad's lap. We all turned to look at Aaron, who nodded, deadpan. I've always wanted to be famous for a lap full of puke. So here's the story of how Aaron had the most uncomfortable flight of his life, followed by some very rude side-eye from a random stranger. We were making the long plane journey back home after visiting my parents on the East Coast. Elijah didn't exist yet. Sylvia was a feisty 1-year-old. My own body never made enough milk for her, no matter how I tried. So on previous flights, we'd had to carry drippy pre-mixed bottles of formula onto the plane. Now Sylvia was ready for cow's milk. How miraculous to simply buy it for her at the airport deli before boarding. On board, I filled a bottle with milk. Sylvia loved it. We were delayed on the tarmac, but nestled in Aaron's lap, she happily drained a whole bottle. When the pilot announced we were cleared for departure, I refilled her bottle since drinking during takeoff was supposed to keep her ears from hurting. As we lifted off, Sylvia chugged the second bottle. She grinned and drank and grinned and drank. Then she turned, smiled broadly at Aaron, paused for a moment, and threw up 16 ounces of milk right into his lap. She wasn't sick. She had just, shall we say, overindulged. We looked at the pool of milk already soaking into his pants. There wasn't much we could do except groan and laugh in that bemused parent way. I dug a cloth out of the diaper bag. Aaron stuffed it down his pants to try to absorb some of the milk. The guy sitting next to him sighed and shifted slightly away in his seat. At our layover, we headed straight to the airport bathroom, me pushing Sylvia's stroller, Aaron walking gingerly with his wet crotch. To our joy, we found a family bathroom. Yay, a single room rather than multiple stalls, a godsend when you have luggage and a stroller and a diaper bag, or when you need a private place to change your pants, which are soaked through with baby puke. Aaron opened the door to enter. Just then, a passing woman shot him a dirty look. That's a family bathroom, she spat, shook her head, and walked on grimly. She hadn't noticed us, his family, standing just behind him. Aaron laughed, but I felt indignant on his behalf. He had earned that trip to the family bathroom because that damp life lesson in its own small way was part of what our ancient rabbis call Sa'ar Gidul Banim, the pain of raising children. Sa'ar Gidul Banim. I'm grateful to the rabbis for this phrase. Do we have an equivalent in English? I don't think so. Yes, there's a lot of conspiratorial eye rolling about sleepless nights and toddler tantrums, and in the teen years ahead, bigger kids, bigger problems, as the expression goes. But I don't know of an English phrase that so neatly and matter-of-factly encapsulates the pain of being a parent. A lap full of milk is, of course, a minuscule experience of this pain. It's temporary, and with the added distance of time and dry pants, hilarious. But it is, I think, still a good example of Tsa'ar Gidul Banim. This pain comes in all sizes, tiny, small, large, vast. It is sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent, sometimes in between. It's accompanied by tremendous joy, which is easier to talk about. But it is also important to acknowledge the rainbow of heartbreak that accompanies any human love, especially the love of something as uncontrollable as another human who is just beginning her journey through life. Tsa'ar Gidul Banim. This single phrase describes an impossibly broad range of parental experience. It's the psychedelic intensity of staring into a newborn's eyes, the twinge of a 3-year-old screaming, "I hate you," when you make them leave the park after a mind-numbing hour of swing pushing, and whatever unimaginable difficulties lie ahead in the teenage years and beyond. And sometimes it's just the physical discomfort of sitting with milk-wet pants for 3 hours on an airplane. We parents are lucky to be parents. Raising children is not only a commandment, be fruitful and multiply, but also a blessing. Jewish tradition is clear on that. When God assures Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, that is a good thing. But not all blessings are easy. And being honest about that fact, at the very least with ourselves, is liberating. Instead of pretending that parenting is one constant state of bliss, it helps to acknowledge, as the rabbis do, that sometimes this blessing can be painful. It's okay if we need to pause and give ourselves the emotional equivalent of a family bathroom, some small pleasure, a little extra space, even if it's just a moment of self-acknowledgement that this is hard work that we're doing. And then we can come back to the sweet moments, to the pure delight in my daughter's face as she retells the story now at the wise old age of 5. She's 10 now, by the way. I smile watching as she explodes into laughter at the thought of her baby self puking in her beloved dad's lap. To her, it's just a silly story, but I hope on some level she understands the story's deeper meaning, that we are here for her, no matter what, even when things get hard, no matter how much it hurts. Underneath that pain, that sa'ar gidul banim, is love, an infinite, almost superhuman love that can hold anything she throws at us, even if it's bound to hurt sometimes.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And so much of, I think, what you kind of explore in the book is how parenthood and becoming a mother for you is a process. It's not something that happens automatically, right? I mean, it may happen overnight, but that doesn't mean that it feels natural immediately, and that there's loss involved, that there's a lot of ambivalence. It's not all shiny, happy, as you say, like, even if it's a blessing, it can be complicated and difficult. So, I loved how you talked about ambivalence and this dynamic, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you use Torah to kind of explore those ideas of ambivalence and paradox.
Yeah, well, you could probably tell this from my bio, but I'm, not a therapist, not a psychologist, not a parenting expert. I'm just artist and Jewish educator who is a parent and is sort of just exploring and trying to understand my own experience. And so I was very relieved when I started doing some research into the ideas about the psychology of parenting, and found this term of maternal or parental ambivalence. That's like actually the psychological term, that it's actually quite normal, or not an unusual thing for caregivers, full-time, like parental figures, basically, people filling that role, to experience all of the joy and gratitude that I had always expected with my very much wanted, baby and experience of motherhood. And also to have like the other realm of human experience, which is sort of the challenge and kind of the loss that comes with bringing something tremendously new into one's life, especially stepping into a tremendously new role and transformative role. I found, for me personally, really meant leaving who I was before in a certain way. And in other ways, of course, I'm who I've always been, but I really had to let go of my previous self. And I was really shocked by how much kind of mourning needed to happen for me. And I think I felt so ashamed of that instinctually, because I thought, how I love this baby so much, I wanted this baby so much, how can there be this sadness about the things that I'm losing? How can there be any loss involved in the blessing of bringing a new human into the world? And it was really there, and it really helped me where, and I think at the beginning I was sort of like gritted teeth, like everything's fine, I'm gonna and it really took me a while, and in a way, writing this book even years later and editing it was part of really coming to understand and have real compassion for the complexity of the experience, and that it didn't mean that I loved it sounds obvious when you say it, but that you can love this creature so much and also just be in this kind of state of at the same time be experiencing the state of mourning or grief for what you're leaving, and that was just a spiritual lesson and a paradox that was quite profound for me. And for some reason it's not hard for me to imagine the sort of spirituality of death, death, which we often only associate with loss. And it's not so hard for me to think, but there is this sort of like letting go and, to think of the positive, it brings out the love, and grief is just the other side of love. That is a little easier for me to integrate than that, like maybe love is the other side of grief.
Right.
Yeah.
There were several pieces where you drew on some of the mystical stories about creation. I mean, and you're thinking, you write about obviously God as a, parent figure in some ways, and then also how parenting is in some ways being like God. And you talk a little bit about some of the mystical versions of creation. So can you tell us that story and sort of what it means to you in this context? And I think you actually had two pieces. One where you were talking about, seems the idea of contraction, and one where you were talking about the shards. So maybe you can pick one or both of those to talk about.
Yeah. Well, as a kind of entry into that, I'll just say, like, I went back and forth with my editor as to whether to call it even God had bad parenting days or has. And in general, like present tense is more recommended for, titles and writing, because it's, it's kind of punchy, right?
Living. Yeah.
And I felt very strongly about, like, what I'm talking about with that is the biblical character of God, who is sometimes in what seems to be a good mood and being very generative and creative and compassionate, and sometimes being extremely judgmental and destroying the world by flood and all sorts of things, destroying cities,
throwing a tantrum, basically.
Yes. And one of the things, we metaphorically refer to God as a parent, right? Traditionally father, but I much prefer gender neutral, or even mother, but it's such a central trope in Jewish relationship to the divine, and not just Jewish, to think, okay, we humans are kind of like children and the divine is like a parent, and we're always the child in that metaphor. And it's an experience of helplessness and kind of beseeching and being grateful for what is given to us. And one of the things I noticed when I became a mother was like, oh, I'm identifying with the God character all of a sudden, where I'm like, yeah, like the Israelites are like complaining in the desert right after you set them free from Egypt. Like, what a bunch of like, whiny, dependent people. Like, they should figure it out, or at least not just be like whining that you liberated them when they were suffering. So I suddenly kind of understood why, or felt that I understood one version of why the character of God might behave in these harsh ways. And I certainly, as a parent, observed myself behaving in harsh ways that, of course, I try to be always calm and I try to always be compassionate, but I can't always access that, and I am human. And the God that we read about in the Torah certainly has these strong elements of human characteristics, whichever way you want to kind of read that, whether we're made in that image of God or whether we're creating God in our image. And so when I think about like the divine in my own prayer life or my own kind of spiritual education with people that I'm working with, that to me is a much more infinite kind of, non-reductive presence that I don't think any one metaphor could really capture. And I don't really like see that as like a character who's, if something happens that I don't like it's like God making this happen. That's not how I experience my own personal relationship with the divine. But when I read Torah and I see this character, I suddenly do have this perspective on God as a parent and having these kind of bad parenting days. So this is all to say that I started to reconsider not just God, and maybe Genesis or Exodus, but also the mystical ideas of God as creating the world out of nothingness. And one of the beautiful Kabbalistic kind of myths that we're taught is that in the beginning there was really nothing, and to create a world or the universe, well, actually, in the beginning, God filled every space. And so to create a universe, God had to make a nothingness within that, right? So there's this withdrawing of God from God's self to make a bit of a vacuum. And then in that vacuum, God created essentially the world. And the way this myth tells it is that they were clay vessels, this beautiful, perfect world. But it was sort of inanimate. So it was beautiful, but didn't have life. And so then God channels some of that divine energy, God's own energy, into the vessels to animate them. But it's too much for the vessels. So they sort of crack and they shatter. And then the world that we're living in is actually those shards. They've sort of fallen in this arrangement. That's everything we see around us. And a spark of that divine light or energy is in everything around us, as well as in each of us. And so we're sort of living in this broken world, looking for ways to liberate those sparks back up to their essence. And there is so much about this that as a parent, I really loved this idea of God having to, I mean, it's another way of saying what I was saying before in a very human sense of having to leave my old life in order to inhabit this new life, having to let go of pre-parent, pre-mother Alicia, to become Mother Alicia. And I really see that movement in this myth of God taking up all the space and then God realizing, like, if I want to make something new, I have to make space for that newness, and I'm going to have to withdraw. And so that feels to me like the process of kind of bringing a child into a family or into a world, however it happens. And then I love also that it like doesn't really go as planned, which I think is probably essential to the process of any kind of parenting. I know it's still pretty early in the journey, but really any project is not going to go the way you think. And I love that brokenness, but also the possibility of ongoing healing, and really the obligation of it is really, to me, kind of written into that mystical creation myth. I think it has so much beauty and compassion in the story itself.
Yeah, I love that. And even just on the level as someone, you know, if you are somebody who had a pregnancy, then often afterwards you feel actually literally like your body is broken, like it broke your body to do that. At least that was my feeling. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And just even that sense that, oh, right, creating something can require breaking things, or they don't go back to being the way they were before.
Yeah. And, you know, in this book, I was really trying to write into that space of the both and, you know, I think so often we sort of like have this glowy, rosy hue on what it means to have a baby, or what it means to become parents. And all that love is true. And it's true that it's a miracle, like however it happens. And then there is the fact that we like live in bodies and live in the world, and it is complex, and there is going to be kind of loss and brokenness tied in with it. And to not go entirely in the direction of focusing only on the difficulty, but to also resist the desire to just sort of not talk about it, because that to me feels so isolating. And it feels like it's kind of like gaslighting to be like, wow, why are you having a challenging time when this is should be the best moment of your life? And to me, it's so much more compassionate to be like, yeah, this is very complex.
Yeah. And you write about a lot of different paradoxes, you know, that are baked into parenting, you know, control and letting go, and sort of the transcendence of aspects, and the incredible mundanity, if that's a word, mundaneness, I guess, of certain aspects. And one of the other mystical concepts that you draw on is the tension between chesed, or loving kindness, and gevura, might. And tell us a little bit about how that shows up in parenting.
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of this mystical concept, and I have to restrain myself anytime it comes up so I don't like bore everyone. But I'm always working to like get a better quick description of this kind of complex mystical concept. But essentially, probably the simplest way that I know how to say it is that among the kind of various balanced energies or ways that God kind of manifests in the world, according to the mystics, there are two central ones, among others, but two of the central ones are compassion and boundaries. And it helps me to remember that these are aligned with the side of the body in mystical thought, especially kind of the shoulder area, but really the whole side. And so the right side is the side of compassion, of overflowing loving kindness, of the word yes. And that's kind of, in God terms, you know, what we encounter when we read these biblical stories I was mentioning of God like acting in infinite love and creating the world and giving humans so much beauty. And then the other side, the left side, is the side of judgment and boundaries and, you know, the word no. And that might be what we're reading about when we read about God kind of punishing in a what seems like a perhaps non-compassionate way, sort of being like, I'm going to destroy the world because it is evil, right? So there's not a lot of middle ground there. And the way that I understand this rabbinic concept is that it neither is better than the other. And in fact, there's a balance point at the heart center that they talked about called tiferet, which kind of means beauty or splendor. And that I kind of understand it to mean that part of our practice as humans is constantly rebalancing our yes and our no, our generosity and our boundaries, and over and over finding the right balance. And sometimes we'll be going too far in one direction, sometimes we'll be going too far in the other direction. Some of the mystical rabbis say that we're sort of born with tendencies one way or another. We have to balance ourselves out. And I love thinking about this in terms of really nitty-gritty things, like if you, and this is not a new observation, but if you say yes to every single thing your child does, including pulling people's hair and running out into the street and, whatever, drawing on the walls and dumping out their pasta, that's not good parenting, right? And on the other hand, if you are just constantly like on them for every little infraction and just correcting and really not balancing that out with love and positivity, that's also bad parenting. And there's a way in which there is a compassion in showing the boundaries to them, right? That's like good parenting. And there's a way in which sometimes you have to kind of create a boundary I find in myself, for example, like if my instinct might be to yell when I see a certain behavior and I kind of intellectually know like that would not be the best way to go about this. It's a form of the Hebrew word is gavora, of boundaries with myself, to take a breath actually and restrain myself to hold a boundary and be like, I'm going to resist this impulse that everything in me is saying, just scream at that kid, but I'm going to resist. And only through that boundary am I able to access a compassionate response. And so it actually is in some ways a very simple concept, and in other ways kind of infinitely complex in how we negotiate it. And I love thinking about that in terms of all kinds of getting through the day quandaries, and certainly in terms of parenting.
Mm-hmm. And I love that the way you talked about it, not as a binary, but actually like they're so interwoven. And in fact, sometimes to access one, you need to draw on one of the others. And also one of the things that I learned from your writing on this is that even though the rabbis recognize that both are really important, that there is a bias towards leaning into compassion, and that you're supposed to put your right shoe on first or whatever, because the right side is compassion. And it's just a reminder that like when you have a choice, try to lean towards compassion.
Literally. Yeah. It's like, we're always looking for the balance, but like, since it's 51% go towards compassion. And they literally do advise to put your right shoe on first in the morning so that you're starting the day on the foot of compassion, which I love.
Yeah, I really love that too. I could probably use a little bit of that reminder. I'm going to be thinking about that as I put it.
And I'll just say, like, I was sort of talking in terms of mostly towards the kid, but I think it's even deeper in some ways to think about it towards ourselves, so that like when I do accidentally kind of lose my cool and yell or whatever the parenting thing is that I didn't want to do I then double down on that by like castigating myself and building this whole narrative of like, oh, I failed and I'm a bad parent, or can I have compassion for myself in that moment, and from that place of more spaciousness and balance go like apologize to my kid and explain that that's not what I wanted to do,
Mm-hmm.
And having sort of the courage to be compassionate towards ourselves, especially when we are in this sacred, intense caretaking role, which actually demands so much overlooking of our own instincts that, you have to kind of push past your instinct to sleep and your instinct to entertain yourself intellectually at times when you need to be pushing on the swings. So I felt like my Gavora was getting such a workout in terms of my boundary side was getting such a workout in very early parenthood of like, push past your needs and show up for the kid. And it was really helpful for me to be like, okay, I have to do that. And I think I need to also develop my compassionate side towards myself and push that forward too, if I'm going to be pushing my boundaries towards myself forward.
Right. And that's important, not only in terms of our own sustainability, but also it's part of modeling, right? It's like when you're compassionate, when you're showing compassion to yourself, that's modeling for your kids also how you treat people, including yourself, with respect and compassion.
Yes, yes.
One of the things that you write about is the home as the temple, like as a, sort of replacement for the temple, and parenting as a kind of sacred act or kind of priesthood. And you write a lot about kind of rituals as part of parenting, some that are traditional, like lighting Shabbat candles or blessing your kids, and some that are ones that are more sort of self-created. And you write also about, giving yourself time and space in your home mikvah of your bath, which reminded me, I think, of the last time you were on JWA's book talks, you read some of your bathtub poems.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about the kind of the ritual piece and how that fits into parenthood.
Well, I love to kind of remember that the Judaism that we read about in the Torah was a temple-focused Judaism, which, primarily what we're reading about and what was probably happening primarily were services occurring in this big, beautiful temple in the center of Jerusalem on a mountain that were highly ritualized and highly stratified in terms of which people were playing which roles. And it's like determined, by birth, essentially, whether you're going to be a priest based on who your father was, right? So it's a very kind of specific, not particularly flexible model from what it sounds like. And then when the Romans destroyed that temple around the year 70, the rabbis were in a position of having to fully reinvent Judaism. And really, one of the things that they came up with was essentially taking some of the structures that temple worship had maintained and transferring them to either the synagogue or the home. And so our prayer services are kind of in place of the sacrifice services, and the Shabbat table at home, there's a way of looking at it that is essentially a way of the sacrificial altar in the temple, which was their way of connecting with God in the most holy way that they knew, is now happens every Friday night, Saturday afternoon, in the home. And there is another table where we're also taking life energy of the food in front of us and turning it into praise of the divine, right? And I just love that as a model for the work that we do in our homes for domestic labor, essentially being kind of the new priestly labor. And I also found new parenthood to be very isolating in so many ways, because like I was tied to my baby's nap schedule. I also moved across the country soon after having my first kid, and that was really much harder than I anticipated. And so I was literally isolated in so many ways, although my husband was here, but I didn't have much community outside of that. And there was so much time just sort of alone, and I started to realize this feels like a meditation retreat. I mean, this sort of silent space where I'm not hooked into the like buzzing productive grid of the world. And it had sort of the challenges and some of the benefits of that kind of retreat. And that idea of like spiritual practice in the home from those two perspectives, from the sort of individual practice perspective of monastic retreat, of motherhood as a monastic practice, early motherhood, which maybe it shouldn't be, but you're going to be alone in the middle of the night, the only one awake sometimes, no matter how much community you have with you. It's a kind of inherently, there is this sort of aloneness moments to it. And then at the same time, this much wider Jewish tradition of the labor that we do at home being not just drudgery, but a way of serving the divine and a way of facilitating our mini community of family to serve the divine and our wider community of friends to serve the divine. And that we're like literally facilitating that the same way that the priests were. I found that really beautiful to think about that. And it wasn't just an idea. It really felt like a philosophy that made it felt like it was reflecting the sacredness of what I was doing, as opposed to trying to kind of read it as not just drudgery. I was like, no, this is actually sacred practice. Like, what is more holy than sort of like preparing food so that we can gather and maintain our traditions and say a couple blessings and pass them on to the next generation, and then keeping this little person safe. That is, that's the kind of like priesthood I'm interested in.
Right. It's so democratized. And I think, I think sometimes we have this tendency to think that some of the like creative ritual practices that people come up with now, that's somehow new. And of course, there's no reason to think that. It's just that, people have been innovating in their homes forever. It wasn't captured by the people who were canonizing things, who were mostly men. But for sure, women have been experiencing that kind of sense of sacred practice for a long time. It just wasn't something that we necessarily had as much, awareness of, or was given voice to as part of normative Judaism. And now I think, in the contemporary world, there's more space to be open about, the kind of fusion of practices or creative practices. There's more sort of permission for that, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement of it. So even to, think of that as like participating in a long tradition of figuring out how you take these practices and make them your own and bring them into your family, that is part of the work that's been the case for a long time, whether we knew it or not.
Yes. And I don't remember if this ended up being in the book, but there's these amazing traditions around like fertility and labor and birth that are, my own Ashkenazi family, reading about the traditions of that part of the world. And that, like, when a woman went into labor, they would untie all the knots in the house to like allow an easy labor, and those kinds of symbolic ritual actions that are not some big public official thing, but can be so supportive and kind of spiritually profound in their own small ways. Yeah, I agree. And I think that we lost a lot of that in the transition to contemporary progressive Judaism. And I think we're like ready to bring it back in.
Yeah. And Miriam in the chat is making a really good point that, of course, women can also do really important work outside of the home and always have. And that wasn't always accepted as a kind of, Jewish practice, but is another way of serving family and community. And I would actually say that the two sometimes go together, because sometimes some of the ways that we end up being creative about our ritual lives comes out of the necessity of the fact that we're doing a lot of other things to serve our communities as well. And so we figure out how to make those pieces work together creatively, not necessarily the way it might have been laid out by the rabbis, who made all sorts of assumptions about who did what in the home and how, who was going to be available to make certain things happen. And that may not be the case anymore. So, or maybe never was for lots of people. So some of that creativity, I think, comes about because exactly for that reason, that women are, living Jewish lives in so many places and ways, and demonstrating service in so many ways that that it sparks a new kind of creativity in terms of practice.
Absolutely.
I was going to say that, one of the things that I that you reference a bunch in the book, and that I've always appreciated is, that when you look at the stories of families in our tradition, they are, fairly dysfunctional. There's definitely, speaking of things that we sometimes think of as modern problems, and you read the Torah and you're like, oh no, there's been a lot of complications around family forever. So some of the stories in the Torah really set the parenting bar pretty low. And I think that can be helpful in terms of recognizing that we don't need to be perfect. But you point out that it's also not always that helpful if you're looking to Torah and to our ancestors in terms of advice. But you do talk about how the rabbis of the Talmud did try to come up with some kind of basic rules and responsibilities of parenthood. Tell us a little bit about the rabbis' version of that and how you read that in a contemporary context.
Yeah, I love the fact that, the rabbis kind of come up with this list of things that you should be sure to really do to be essentially a good parent. And, it's like make sure they have a livelihood, and make sure they can swim. And it's really, when I wrote about this in my essay, I wrote in the context of, I feel sometimes with contemporary expectations of parenting, that there's this sense of like, it's up to you to determine the entire future of your child's life, and everything that you do will be echoing through time forever, and every mistake you make will traumatize them, and every leg up that you give them will positively echo through, you know. And I mean, there's good pushback against the sort of not letting kids fail idea. That there's really good positive material out there about letting them also fail and learn their own lessons. But I still find that, at least for like a type A person like me, I am so drawn to being like, how can I be the best parent I can possibly be? And there's really no end to it, even within just a day, but just, I feel like I could always have been better. And that led me to be extremely grateful for this little simple list the rabbis give us, where I kind of felt like it's like a checklist for like, listen, this is like, you're really need to do these things, and everything else, like, do the best you can. Yes, show up. Yes, of course, you know, be loving and try not to yell, and, you know, be compassionate and listen well, and all those things, 100%. But if you know, I mean, it kind of goes back to the Jewish idea of like, there are mitzvot, these commandments that we are, you know, according to traditional Judaism, commanded to do. And if you do it, like, you don't have to be like transported by ecstasy while you're doing it. It still works. If you're like, if you get a little distracted while you're, you know, like maybe lighting a Shabbat candle or something like that, it's not like, if you're not like super focused with the absolute best, most spiritual version of yourself, you didn't really do it. And I really appreciate that kind of behavioral aspect of like, yes, it's wonderful to go super deep into the intention of things. And no, we'd never want to go fully into the just like, I'm an automaton doing things. And the rabbis are very aware of that danger as well. But there's a relief in being like, listen, just like be a good enough mother or father or parent, do a good enough job. And I really appreciated that, like, teaching a child to swim was among this very short list of what it means to do a good enough job. And it really is like, give them tools to go live their life. Like, you don't have to live their life for them. You're not like going to be able to control what happens, but you have to give them these tools, and then they're going to be on their path and they're going to build their life.
Yeah. Right. And all the different ways that we can interpret that now, right? Like, it, you know, just about survival skills, or sort of the basics that are as you said, they'll do with them what they will, but it's about sort of those tools.
Yes, and I say this with all humility. I'm sure there are people that are like, you have an 8 and 10-year-old, what are you talking about? I have great humility about, like, I have no idea what lies ahead, but this is me trying to figure out kind of just how to be a parent in the moment. Yeah.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you do all these other kinds of amazing creative work. And I'm thinking particularly about your Girls in Trouble song cycle and curriculum. And I was wondering, given, as we were just saying, that there's a lot of sort of bad role models in the Torah, were there particular biblical women who you kind of saw as models, or who spoke to you in some way around parenting?
That's a great question. I mean, you mean in a positive way and not a negative example?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, you can share a negative one too.
You know, I think what comes to me when you say that is actually thinking about Eve as the first mother. And I wrote a song about her that was really focused on like, wow, she had no parenting books or advice books or mom circles or, you know, none of this. And she, in my imagination, had to really figure it out on her own, and ended up really having this as dysfunctional relationship as you could possibly have between her, two of her sons. And sort of the trauma of that as a mother, of watching your sons grow up to be, one of them to be so violent to the other one, and then to be punished for his violence. So really no one seems to end up, at least out of out of Cain and Abel. Neither of them seem to end up in a good situation, really. And I think I'll just, it's not a good parenting example necessarily, but I find so much compassion in the example of a mother who like did her best and maybe didn't have the tools to know how to like properly discipline Cain and give Abel more street smarts or whatever it was that happened there, that she's kind of the ultimate proto mother, and yet how it ends up is so complicated. And to me, it reminds me of like, watching Game of Thrones. I'm always like, wow, my life is not that bad.
I think also one of the things that you said about Eve that really struck me was that she didn't have any community. She had no one else to talk to. And I think that's one of the themes that comes through again and again in your book also, is just the importance of collective, that there can be something very lonely about being a parent. And we learn so much from both watching other people, but also being able to just commiserate. And I think, you talked about the fact that you moved as a young, in your early days of parenthood and how hard that was. And I'm sure that influenced some of what you were writing about. But, but I think we see that so much, like so much of the kind of like mommy literature is about sort of like mom friends and the importance of that and sort of finding community and isolation. And then you think of Eve being the first and being alone and not having anyone to say like, oh no, this is normal, or oh no, you need help with this, or, let me spell you for a moment, it's like whatever the thing is. That is a heartbreaking element of that story as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so many of the mothers I think are like came from another place, and I'm thinking about like Rebecca and how she's like really playing favorites between her sons and kind of pitting one against the other. And there's so much palpable love for Jacob, but also this kind of like rejection of Esau essentially. And it's interesting thinking about how like she wasn't living in the place that she came from. I wonder how much depth of counsel and warmth she had as she was like learning to raise these boys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And we have some comments in the chat about just how complicated it is to look at these stories, and how much also we don't necessarily have stories that speak to parenting in ways that we might see as positive models. And that is an invitation to us to create feminist midrash that might fill some of that in, which of course is what you've done, Alicia, with Girls in Trouble, which is amazing. And I urge everyone to check that out, both the music and the lesson plans.
So many other people doing amazing work to create feminist.
Yes, there's a ton, but I will just call that out because I think it's so beautiful. One of the things that you write about is the importance of modeling hope as part of parenting. And I was really struck by that just because I think in this moment, it can be really hard to do that. At least I find it hard. How do you have any tips for how to cultivate hope and model that in our relationships?
Yeah, I really love Rebecca Solnit's writing on hope, and I kind of return to that over and over again. And just many people who have written about hope not being something where we let go of also seeing all the difficulties around us, not being a kind of simple hope. But I think to me, at this point in my life, hope and love are similarly, I have a stronger sense of them than I did when I was younger, and of the power of each of them, that it's a little bit mystical and mysterious. The way that love can, like, when love can be, it can truly change the way things are, and I think it can sound so kind of loosey-goosey to talk about it that way. But I think it's really to undervalue the power of love, to simply act on the rational, same way that, I think it's tied to ideas of also spirituality. It's kind of an emotional version of spirituality. And like we do have these muscles that are not necessarily simply intellectual or structural or planful. And if we don't, they're kind of our wings, I think, like love and hope, right? And so the situation maybe absolutely dire, but retaining the awareness that things could be otherwise, as the beautiful Norman Fisher book with that title, things could be otherwise. Like, this is not the only way that things could be, and it is not the only way that they will be. And who knows what will happen in our lifetime or what will happen later. But I think it's a form of humility to kind of acknowledge that things can change, and they can, just as they can change for the worse, they can change for the better. And I also return to some of like the basic rabbinic precepts of, for example, like, it's not your responsibility to complete the work, but you're also not free to abandon it. Like, just that simple, like, to me, that is about hope. That's saying you may not be able to, no one person maybe can see the big picture of how this important change can happen or how this terrible thing can be solved. But each of us has to show up, and in that individual small accretion of small acts of what we each can do, that there is a power in that's beyond what we can grasp with our intellect. So that's what I think of when you ask that.
Yeah, I think also, as you were speaking, I was thinking also about just the importance of trust and sort of, as we were saying with like the rabbinic suggestion that we try to lean into compassion, like leaning into trust and just believing that trust in humanity, that humanity can do better or can do the right thing, and won't always, but that there is, as you're saying, the possibility of that, and trying to infuse that sense of trust.
Yeah, and I think in a way it goes back to what I was saying about the behavioral, the behavioral approach to like not sort of like show up and do the next right thing. And like it's too big to try for any person to be thinking about literally that person's or any family solving these huge, huge problems that we're facing. But the act of like bringing a meal to somebody who needs a meal. I mean, if you've ever received a meal when you needed one, like, I feel like that to me is like the epitome of hope. It's like, oh, somebody cares and I'm being nourished, and like there is human goodness. And I've just felt like how healing that is when you're recovering from surgery or whatever, to have that. And it's like way beyond the power of just the food. There's like the hope and the love in that act. So yeah, that idea of just doing the next right thing, and small actions. And as the mystics would say about this idea of a broken world that contains sparks and everything, they might use the language of liberating these sparks, of sort of doing the next right thing that returns this goodness, that liberates one little tight spot and allows that spark to return to the divine, or kind of allows some healing to happen. And that's more powerful, I think, than we can know.
Mm-hmm. And it's related to the compassion you were talking about, having compassion for ourselves, that we don't feel we have the expectation that we have to complete everything, but also it's about making space. Like when we take on some piece, we also make space for somebody else to do another piece of the work. And I think that gets back to the sense that like, we're not doing any of this in a vacuum, and the sense of isolation that can be part of modern life, and especially in the last few years, can be very paralyzing. And so, that's part of why I love reading books like this, where you feel a sense of access into someone else's experience, and it just makes it reminds us that we are in this together in the most big and small ways.
Absolutely. And that's how I feel about Jewish texts. Like, ultimately, that's what I love about Jewish texts. And that's why I wanted to write a book like this. It's like, I'm trying to draw out these moments in Jewish stories or traditions or mystical ideas or rabbinic precepts that remind me that I'm part of something bigger, that we're all part of something bigger. And like those of us who have, are part of the Jewish community, have like the beautiful, have this tremendous blessing of thousands of years of people reaching out to each other, and eventually to us, and through us to other people, with this sort of wisdom and connection. And then everyone who isn't part, I kind of want to write this also for people who might want to have access to that wisdom and who aren't part of the Jewish community, the same way I want to learn from other communities, and just sort of connect these sparks of light, and remember that we're not alone.
Well, thank you, Alicia, so much for this conversation, for this book, for all of your work, for giving us access to new ways of thinking about Torah and our lives. I really feel lucky that we have gotten to work with you many times, and I want to direct people to some of that. You can find excerpts of Alicia's amazing curriculum on biblical women, Girls in Trouble, on our site. Draws on a song cycle. There's CDs. Do people listen to CDs? Whatever. There's music out there. You can also watch her previous book talk and read a piece that she wrote for us, with excerpts from her poetry collection, Fruit Geode. You can find a Kaddish for Bernie Madoff on various streaming services. So please check out more of Alicia's work. For all of you who are here, thank you for being with us tonight. And for many of you for being with us regularly. This was the third of our 4-part series that we're currently in. So please join us next time, which is in 2 weeks, December 15th, same time, same place, for an important conversation with Dr. Ilana Stokman on her book, When Rabbis Abuse. Save the date also in advance for our winter series. We're doing something new this winter, a film series instead of a book series. That's going to begin on January 26th. We'll be discussing some American Jewish films, some standard, some lesser known, which you will stream beforehand and then join us for the talks. So I really want to thank all of you again for being with us tonight, and look forward to seeing you soon. And until next time, be well and take good care.
Thank you all. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, JWA.
It was wonderful to be together. Good night, everybody.